In the summer of 1940, the world held its breath. Europe was in flames. Poland had fallen. France, once a mighty power, lay defeated under the boots of the Wehrmacht. And across the Channel, the last beacon of freedom stood alone: Britain. This was the moment when the fate of Western civilization hung by a thread. What came next would not be decided by vast armies or grand fleets, but by a small band of young men flying high above the green fields of England. They would become known as the Few, and their courage would change the course of history. When France fell in June 1940, the shock was immediate. The German Blitzkrieg, fast, brutal, unstoppable, had swept through Europe in mere weeks. Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill had been in office only a month, yet already he faced the greatest challenge any British leader had ever known. From Berlin, Adolf Hitler turned his gaze toward the English Channel. He expected Britain to seek peace, perhaps even surrender, but Churchill had other plans. "We shall fight on the beaches," he declared in Parliament, his voice unyielding. "We shall never surrender." That single speech sent a message, not just to the British people, but to the entire world. Britain would fight on. In July 1940, Hitler issued Directive Number 16, its code name, Operation Sea Lion. The plan called for a full-scale invasion of southern England. But there was a problem. To land troops on British soil, Germany needed control of the skies. Without it, the Royal Navy and the RAF would destroy any invasion fleet before it reached shore. Thus began the prelude to one of the most decisive battles in modern history, a battle for air superiority over Britain. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, entered the campaign with overwhelming strength. Around 2,600 aircraft, including the feared Messerschmitt, Bf 109 fighters, and the twin-engine Heinkel Heeksche 11-1, Junkers Ju 88, and Dornier Du 17 bombers. Opposing them were the men of the Royal Air Force Fighter Command, led by Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding. He commanded roughly 640 operational fighters, mostly Supermarine Spitfires and Hawker Hurricanes. On paper, the odds were grim, 4-1 against the RAF, but Britain had something Germany did not: a revolutionary defensive network called the Dowding system, linking radar stations, observer posts, and command centers. It would become the backbone of Britain's air defense. As the threat loomed, Britain prepared. Across the countryside, sandbags lined windows, and children were evacuated from London to rural towns. Posters reminded citizens, "Keep calm and carry on." In the words of one London mother recorded in 1940, "We sent our little boy away on a train. He was 6. We waved, and I don't think any of us said what we were thinking, that we might never see them again." It was a time of fear and determination, of quiet bravery among ordinary people. Before the skies over England truly ignited, Hitler's air forces tested Britain's defenses through a series of smaller engagements. The Kanalkampf, or Channel Battles, beginning on July 10, 1940. German bombers attacked shipping convoys in the English Channel, hoping to lure RAF fighters into combat and deplete their numbers. The Channel became a deadly trap. Merchant ships burned in the water. RAF squadrons scrambled daily from bases in southern England: Tangmere, Manston, Biggin Hill. One RAF pilot, Sergeant Geoffrey Wellham, later recalled, "You'd be climbing flat out, the sky full of dots. Then suddenly, they weren't dots anymore. They were bombers, and you were in the thick of it." These early skirmishes tested both sides. The Luftwaffe learned Britain would not yield easily. The RAF learned the limits of its endurance. Britain's secret weapon lay hidden along its coastlines: the chain-home radar network. Tall steel towers scanned the skies, sending back echoes of approaching aircraft. This information was fed to the filter rooms, where members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAF, plotted raids on huge maps, tracking enemy formations in real time. From there, Fighter Command could direct squadrons precisely where they were needed, saving precious time, fuel, and lives. Without radar, Britain would have been blind. With it, they could see the enemy coming from miles away. Even today, historians agree, this technological edge may have been the single greatest factor in Britain's survival. In Berlin, Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring was confident. He believed the RAF could be destroyed within weeks. His intelligence underestimated British aircraft production and failed to grasp the effectiveness of radar. He promised Hitler that air superiority would be achieved swiftly, after which Operation Sea Lion could begin. But as the Luftwaffe began its full assault in mid-August, it discovered an enemy that refused to break. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched closely. Although officially neutral, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was alarmed by the situation. He knew that if Britain fell, there would be nothing standing between Nazi Germany and global domination. American journalists, like Edward R. Murrow, broadcast live from London during air raids. His voice, calm amid chaos, reached millions of American homes. "This, is London," Murrow said during one bombing. "The lights have gone out, but the people of the city have not." His words stirred American hearts. Public sympathy for Britain began to rise. Soon, American factories would quietly begin supplying Britain with vital aircraft engines, munitions, and fuel. The first steps toward what would later become the Lend-Lease program. By late July, combat intensified. Fighter pilots flew 3, sometimes 4 sorties a day. They were exhausted but determined. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, a legless ace who flew with prosthetic limbs, embodied that spirit. He famously said, "Rules are for the obedience of fools and the guidance of wise men." Bader's aggressive tactics and leadership inspired many, but not all returned from their missions. By August, the RAF's casualty lists were growing. While pilots fought in the skies, civilians endured on the ground. Air raid sirens wailed across cities. Children carried gas masks to school. Families huddled in underground shelters. One young Londoner recalled, "You'd lie there listening to the bombs fall. You could feel the ground shake. Then silence. And you'd wonder who hadn't made it this time." In factories across Britain, thousands of women took up work building aircraft and ammunition. The nation was mobilized. Every man, woman, and child a part of the defense. By early August 1940, the stage was set. The Luftwaffe had completed reconnaissance flights, mapping radar stations, airfields, and coastal defenses. British intelligence, through its own ultra-decrypts, was beginning to read German communications, though that information was still used sparingly at this stage. Dowding knew the storm was coming. He urged his pilots to conserve strength. "Never chase the enemy too far," he warned. "Every aircraft we lose weakens the shield." On August 13, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched Adlertag, Eagle Day. It was the beginning of the full-scale assault on Britain. From France, Holland, and Norway, waves of German bombers took off. Their target, Erie RAF airfields and radar stations in southern England. That day alone, over 1,500 German sorties were launched. The RAF scrambled 700 fighters in response. The skies were alive with fire and smoke. Bombers fell flaming into the sea. Spitfires and hurricanes tore through formations. By nightfall, both sides had suffered heavy losses. But the RAF still stood, and so began the long, brutal fight that would determine the fate of Europe. The battle for Britain had begun. It would test courage, endurance, and faith, not just in weapons, but in the spirit of a nation. July 1940. The fate of Britain hung in the balance. Across the Channel, invasion barges gathered in the harbors of France and Belgium. Rows of German troops waited, watching the gray outline of England through mist and distance. The plan had a name: Operation Sea Lion. It was to be the invasion of Britain, the final blow in Hitler's lightning conquest of Europe. But before the German army could set foot on English soil, one thing had to be done. The Royal Air Force had to be destroyed. On July 16, 1940, Hitler signed Directive No. 16. It declared, "Since Britain, despite her hopeless military situation, shows no signs of readiness to come to terms, I have decided to prepare a landing operation against her. The invasion would only proceed, however, once air superiority had been secured. For that, Hitler turned to his powerful Luftwaffe commander, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. Göring was boastful, arrogant, and utterly convinced of victory. He promised the Führer that the RAF would be annihilated in a matter of weeks. "When I am finished with the RAF," Göring declared, "not a single enemy aircraft will fly over Germany." Back in Britain, the defense network, the Dowding system, was coming fully online. Radar stations along the coast, known as Chain Home, scanned the skies day and night. Observer posts watched with binoculars from cliff tops and church towers. Inside Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding coordinated the defense through a web of telephones, maps, and message boards. Squadrons were held at readiness across the south. Biggin Hill, Tangmere, Kenley, Northolt, and Hornchurch. Each airfield a potential target, each one vital. Pilots slept beside their aircraft, helmets resting on their knees, waiting for the single word that would change everything. Scramble! The first real blows of the Battle of Britain fell not on cities but on the sea. This was the Kanalkampf, or Battle of the Channel, a series of violent engagements over shipping routes in the English Channel. Beginning in mid-July 1940, German bombers targeted merchant convoys bringing vital supplies to Britain. The goal was to lure the RAF into combat, to bleed it dry before the main assault. Convoy Bread, Peewit, and Bosom, these were the names of small merchant fleets ambushed in the Channel. The Luftwaffe's Stuka dive bombers screamed down from the clouds, their sirens wailing, a sound that froze the blood. RAF fighters of number, 11 Group, commanded by Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, responded swiftly. Hurricanes and Spitfires streaked into the fight, dog-fighting over the white cliffs of Dover in the open sea. We were climbing to meet them when I saw the Channel beneath us, a beautiful, glittering surface, and then it erupted. Bombs hit a tanker. Flames shot skyward. The smell of burning oil filled the cockpit even at 1,000 feet. The RAF paid dearly for each interception. For every merchant ship lost, fighter pilots risked everything to defend the narrow waters. By late July, both sides had learned lessons. The Luftwaffe realized the RAF would fight ferociously. Dowding, meanwhile, saw the need to conserve his pilots. He could replace machines but not men. The Chain Home radar network now proved its worth. From Dover to the Isle of Wight, radar masts detected incoming aircraft long before they reached the coast. Operators could estimate altitude, heading, and strength, allowing Fighter Command to direct squadrons precisely where needed. A WAF radar operator named Joan Fenn remembered, "We'd hear the blip appear on the screen and call it in. You could almost feel the tension rise in the room. You knew, somewhere, men were strapping in, engines starting." Radar's early warning gave the RAF minutes, sometimes only minutes, but it was enough to get fighters airborne before the bombs fell. This advantage would prove decisive in the weeks ahead. The Luftwaffe entered the battle confident but divided. Their command was split among Luftflotten 2, 3, and 5, each responsible for different regions. Northern France, Belgium, and Norway. They fielded a wide mix of aircraft: the Messerschmitt Bf-109 for air superiority, the Bf-110 as a twin-engine escort fighter, in bombers like the Heinkel He-111, Junkers Ju-88, and Dornier De-17. Early raids revealed weaknesses. The Bf-110, heavily armed but slow, proved vulnerable to nimble Spitfires. Bomber formations flying without tight escort suffered terrible losses. Gradually, German tactics shifted, flying higher, tightening formation discipline, and focusing attacks on specific coastal airfields. Air Chief Marshal Dowding's defensive strategy was as elegant as it was efficient. He organized Fighter Command into 4 groups. Number 11 Group, under Keith Park, defending southeast England and London. Number 12 Group under Trafford Lee-Mallory, covering the Midlands and providing backup. Number 10 Group under Sir Quintin Brand, defending the southwest. Number 13 Group under Richard Saul, covering the north. Number 11 Group bore the brunt of the attacks. Their pilots were young, often barely 20 years old. Many were still learning aerial combat in the midst of battle. One pilot, Flying Officer Alan Deere, recalled, "We didn't think of the odds. You saw the bombers, you went for them. You fired until your guns jammed or your ammo ran out. Then you went home and did it again." Though officially neutral, American influence began to show. British purchasing commissions had been sent to the United States to buy aircraft and engines. Factories in California and New York turned out Curtiss P-40s, Hudsons, and engines for Spitfires and Hurricanes. And a handful of American volunteers quietly made their way across the Atlantic. They would soon form the Eagle Squadrons, RAF units made up of U.S. pilots. In a letter home, one volunteer wrote, "We're not supposed to be here, but we can't just sit and watch. If England falls, everything we believe in goes with it." Though small in number during the early battle, these men symbolized a growing connection between Britain and the United States, a bond that would later define the Allied victory. While the air war raged, German preparations for Operation Sea Lion continued. The invasion was scheduled for mid-September. Over 2,000 barges and 400 tugs were gathered along the French and Belgian coasts to carry troops across the Channel. But the Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy, had serious doubts. Admiral Erich Raeder warned Hitler that without air superiority, the invasion fleet would be slaughtered by the Royal Navy. Still, Hitler pressed on. Göring promised he would sweep the RAF from the sky. The next phase of the battle would test that promise. By the end of July, losses were mounting. The RAF had lost 96 aircraft, the Luftwaffe over 190. Yet the Germans could afford the losses, for now. Göring grew impatient. He demanded a decisive blow. He called it Adlertag, Eagle Day, the moment when the Luftwaffe would strike with full force. But before Eagle Day came, there was one more brutal encounter, a preview of the storm to come. On August 8, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched a massive assault on convoy Peewit off the Isle of Wight. Over 100 German aircraft swarmed the ships. The RAF responded with Hurricanes and Spitfires from Tangmere in Middle Wallop. The fighting was fierce. 4 ships were sunk, others badly damaged. The Luftwaffe lost 31 aircraft, the RAF 19. It was a costly draw, but Britain had held. In just 1 month, Britain's pilots had endured more than most soldiers face in a year. They lived by the hour, scramble, fight, land, refuel, and scramble again. Mechanics worked around the clock to keep aircraft flying. Ground crews patched bullet holes, replaced wings, changed engines, often under fire. At night, pilots returned to blacked-out villages, their faces streaked with oil, their nerves stretched thin. One RAF ground crewman wrote in his diary, "They come back like ghosts. You see the light of their aircraft over the horizon, and you count them. 1, 2, 3. And when one doesn't come back, you just get ready for the next." By early August, Göring believed the RAF was nearly beaten. He was wrong. Disastrously wrong. British aircraft production, coordinated by Lord Beaverbrook, was surging. Factories in Castle Bromwich, Southampton, and Coventry were producing over 300 fighters per week. Pilots were being trained faster than ever. Replacements came from the Empire. Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, Poles, Czechs, all joining the fight for Britain's survival. One Polish pilot, Joseph František, would later become one of the highest-scoring aces of the battle. The RAF was battered but unbroken, and in its command rooms, radar operators watched the skies, seeing patterns form over northern France that spoke of something massive. The Luftwaffe was about to make its move. On the morning of August 13, 1940, Waves of German aircraft filled the sky. Their engines roared like thunder across the channel. This was Eagle Day, the opening of the main assault on Britain. The real battle was about to begin. August 13, 1940. Dawn broke over the French coast, calm, cloudless, and deceptively peaceful. But in the hangars of Pas-de-Calais, Normandy, and Holland, engines were already warming. The Luftwaffe was preparing for its grand offensive, the day Hermann Göring had promised would crush the Royal Air Force once and for all. It was Adlertag, Eagle Day, the moment when the battle for Britain would erupt in full fury. At 0500 hours, the first formations of German bombers lifted off. Heinkels, Dorniers, and Junkers, escorted by sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, rose into the summer sky. Their targets, radar stations along Britain's southern coast and RAF airfields deep in the southeast. If these could be destroyed, Britain's defenses would collapse. But even before the first wave reached the coast, Chain Home Radar had spotted them. Within minutes, telephones rang inside Fighter Command's operations room at Bentley Priory. Plotters, mostly young women of the WAAF, marked moving counters on the Great Table Map. Sector controllers issued the command. Squadron scramble! 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 Engines roared to life across southern England. Spitfires from 54 Squadron at Hornchurch, Hurricanes from Tangmere and Biggin Hill. One by one, they took to the sky. The battle had begun. By mid-morning, the sky above the channel boiled with contrails and flame. German bombers, tight in formation, crossed the coast near Dover and Folkestone. Below them, British anti-aircraft guns opened fire, the thunder of explosions echoing off the white cliffs. Squadron leader Sailor Milan, a South African ace, led his men into the attack. They were above us, a great mass of them. Like a black cloud, he recalled years later. We went straight up through them, guns blazing. The fighting was ferocious. Bombers broke apart under the impact of 20mm cannon fire. Parachutes blossomed in the air, some British, some German. Despite the chaos, many German raids failed to hit their targets accurately. Poor coordination, strong winds, and determined RAF resistance blunted the first blow. By evening, Göring's Eagle Day offensive had faltered. Of the 1,485 sorties launched, more than 45 German aircraft were destroyed. The RAF lost 13 fighters, serious losses but far from the decisive blow Göring had promised Hitler. Worse still, many of the German attacks had been poorly timed. Cloud cover delayed squadrons. Communications between bomber and fighter wings broke down. Some raids even bombed empty airfields or open fields. Still, the message was clear. The Luftwaffe would not stop. Over the next 3 weeks, the pressure would only intensify. From August 14th to August 24th, the Luftwaffe focused relentlessly on RAF Fighter Command's airfields, particularly those of number 11 Group, which defended London and the southeast, Biggin Hill, Kenley, Hornchurch, Tangmere, North Weald, names that would become legend. Wave after wave of bombers struck these targets. Hangars were destroyed, runways cratered. Fuel depots set ablaze. At Kenley Airfield, bombs exploded among parked Hurricanes. One witness remembered, "You could see the heat through the control tower windows. The ground shook with every hit. We thought the whole place would go up." Despite the destruction, RAF mechanics and ground crews worked through the night, patching runways, refueling aircraft, and salvaging anything still usable. Within hours, many of the same squadrons were back in the air. Behind the front lines, Lord Beaverbrook's Ministry of Aircraft Production was performing miracles. Factories in Birmingham, Southampton, and Manchester were producing hundreds of fighters every week. Each morning, trains carried new Spitfires and Hurricanes to the airfields. Old aircraft were repaired, repainted, and returned to service. For every fighter lost in combat, another was waiting on the assembly line. Beaverbrook's relentless push meant that RAF strength actually increased during August. Despite heavy daily losses, This industrial resilience, powered by thousands of workers, many of them women, was one of Britain's greatest yet least visible weapons. As airfields and radar sites were bombed, civilians living nearby found themselves in the line of fire. Villages across Kent, Surrey, and Sussex suffered random destruction. Bombs intended for runways fell among homes and farms. At Croydon, near London, a residential neighborhood was hit directly. A survivor remembered, "I saw a whole row of houses gone, just dust and fire." A man was standing in the street calling for his wife. She'd been in the kitchen when it hit. Air raid sirens became a daily soundtrack. Children slept in Anderson shelters in back gardens. Families learned to recognize the distant hum of aircraft engines and to tell German bombers from British fighters by sound alone. And yet, morale held. Churchill visited bombed areas, shaking hands, promising Britain would endure. His words, spoken that August, echoed through the airwaves. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Then came August 18th, a date that would go down in history as the hardest day. Both sides launched major operations. For the Luftwaffe, it was an attempt to break fighter command once and for all. For the RAF, it was a day of desperate survival. At 11 a.m., radar picked up multiple German formations heading toward southern England. Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons scrambled from Biggin Hill, Hornchurch, Tangmere, and Kenley. The Luftwaffe attacked in 3 massive waves. Stukas dived on RAF airfields at Ford, Gosport, and Thorney Island. Bombers struck Biggin Hill repeatedly, destroying hangars and setting the station ablaze. Ground crews fought fires as aircraft landed amid the chaos. One mechanic, Corporal Bill Thompson, later said, "It was like hell on earth. You couldn't hear yourself think. Just engines, explosions, and the scream of Stukas." The RAF counterattacked fiercely. Over the Isle of Wight, hurricanes of number. 43 Squadron intercepted a formation of Stukas, shooting down 10 in minutes. But the cost was terrible. By sunset, both sides had suffered grievous losses. The Luftwaffe lost 69 aircraft, its heaviest one-day loss so far. The RAF lost 34 fighters, and several airfields were left in ruins. It was the most brutal day of the entire campaign. But once again, the RAF had survived. At Bentley Priory, Air Chief Marshal Dowding faced an agonizing decision. His pilots were exhausted. Many squadrons were down to half strength. He pleaded with the Air Ministry for reinforcements from number. 12 group, but coordination problems and personal rivalries slowed the response. Dowding's calm exterior masked deep strain. He rarely smiled, rarely slept. But his strategy, conserving fighters, rotating squadrons, relying on radar, continued to frustrate Göring's attempts to deliver a knockout blow. In France, Hermann Göring was losing patience. He could not understand how the RAF continued to fight despite the pounding of its airfields. His intelligence officers assured him that fighter command was nearly destroyed. But the raids kept meeting fierce resistance. In truth, the Germans had misjudged British production and repair capabilities. What Göring saw as victory was, in reality, illusion. Furious, he decided to change tactics. From now on, the Luftwaffe would shift its focus. No longer just airfields and radar. The attacks would now target London itself. Hitler approved the plan. He wanted to break British morale by striking its heart. It would prove to be a fatal mistake. For RAF pilots, the daily routine had become a cycle of exhaustion and adrenaline. They lived, fought, and slept beside their aircraft. Squadron diaries describe airmen napping under the wings of Spitfires, tea mugs balanced on toolboxes, their uniforms stained with oil and sweat. Every day, new faces arrived, some from distant corners of the world. Polish and Czech pilots, hardened by their own defeats, brought experience and fury. Their kill rates soared. One British officer noted, "They were magnificent. They fought with a vengeance, as if each German plane carried the flag of their lost country. Personal accounts reveal the emotional toll of the battle. Pilot Jeffrey Wellham, then just 19, wrote, "You climb, heart pounding, sweat in your eyes. Then you see them, black crosses, sunlight flashing on canopies. You close in. The sky becomes a cage of death. When you land, your hands are shaking, not from fear, but from being alive." For ground crews, there was no rest either. They worked by torchlight through the night, filling bullet holes with tape and metal patches. The next morning, those same aircraft were back in combat. In the towns surrounding the airfields, civilians did what they could to help. Local farmers dragged crashed pilots from wrecked aircraft. Villagers brought tea and blankets to the wounded. The sound of battle became part of daily life. Children in Kent learned to identify aircraft by engine tone. As one 10-year-old evacuee recalled later, "We used to count parachutes as they fell. We didn't know who they were. We just hoped they'd live." By the end of August, it seemed that the strain might finally break the RAF. Losses were mounting. Airfields like Biggin Hill had been bombed into rubble multiple times. Fighter Command's reserves were thin. But the spirit of defiance, the same one Churchill had called upon, held firm. Dowding refused to withdraw. Keith Park, commanding No. 11 Group, told his pilots simply, "We fight until there's nothing left." And the British public, listening to radio reports each night, continued to believe in the few. The Luftwaffe had unleashed its fury, but instead of breaking Britain's spirit, each attack seemed to strengthen it. And soon, the fight would move to London. The next phase of the battle was about to begin. It would bring terror to the cities, fire to the night skies, and a new kind of war for the people of Britain. The battle for the airfields was over, but the battle for Britain's heart had only just begun. By late August 1940, the Battle of Britain had entered its most dangerous phase. The skies above England were filled daily with combat. Airfields burned, towns were scarred, and the Royal Air Force, the last shield between Britain and invasion, was nearing exhaustion. For 6 relentless weeks, the Luftwaffe had attacked without pause. From dawn until dusk, bombers and fighters crossed the channel in waves. Every day brought new losses, new funerals, and new scars. But for Britain, the darkest days were yet to come. At airfields across southern England, fatigue had become the enemy. Pilots barely slept. Some had flown more than 200 combat sorties in just over a month. Many were still teenagers. Squadron leader Douglas Bader later said, "We didn't count days anymore. You slept when you could, ate when you could, and when the phone rang, you ran." Ground crews worked 20-hour shifts. Engines were replaced under candlelight. Bullets were loaded by hand until fingers bled. Even so, the RAF kept fighting. Every dawn brought the same command: scramble! By the end of August, both sides were bleeding. The RAF had lost more than 560 aircraft, while the Luftwaffe had lost over 750, most of them bombers. Yet numbers told only part of the story. The RAF's infrastructure, its airfields, control centers, and radar stations, was under immense strain. At Biggin Hill, Kenley, and Hornchurch, hangars lay in ruins. Pilots took off from grass strips, dodging bomb craters as they climbed. Still, radar stations continued to operate, providing crucial minutes of warning that often meant the difference between victory and annihilation. The Luftwaffe, frustrated but not defeated, launched Operation Loge, a concentrated push to destroy what was left of Fighter Command. Between August 24th and September 6th, Goering's air fleets struck airfields relentlessly, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. Their intelligence maps showed the RAF near collapse. They believed one last effort would finish it. At North Weald, bombs fell directly on dispersal areas. At Gravesend, hangars burst into flames. At Biggin Hill, the control tower was obliterated. For 3 days, Biggin Hill was barely operational. And yet, the next morning, its hurricanes were back in the air. A mechanic named Arthur White wrote in his diary, "We worked in smoke and rubble. The lads came back, landed in the mud, and we got them airborne again. There was no time for fear. Then on the night of August 24th, fate intervened. A small group of German bombers, aiming for an airfield, accidentally dropped bombs on London. The damage was minor, but the consequences would be enormous. Churchill immediately ordered retaliation. The next night, RAF Bomber Command struck Berlin. Though militarily insignificant, the raid infuriated Hitler. He vowed revenge. On September 4th, he addressed the German people in a fiery speech. When the British Air Force drops 2 or 3 bombs on our cities, we will drop hundreds on theirs. We will erase their cities from the map. The next day, Göring issued new orders. The Luftwaffe would shift its focus away from RAF airfields and begin massive daylight raids on London. The change in strategy was catastrophic for Germany. By redirecting attacks from RAF bases to London, Hitler gave Fighter Command the breathing space it desperately needed. Airfields repaired, squadrons regrouped, and the RAF, bloodied but alive, began to rebuild its strength. At 4:30 p.m. on September 7th, radar operators detected what seemed impossible: a single vast formation of aircraft stretching across the channel. More than 350 bombers, escorted by 600 fighters, headed directly for London. Sirens wailed across the city. People poured into shelters, cellars, and underground stations. From the docks at Woolwich to the warehouses of East London, bombs rained down. Fuel tanks exploded. The Thames burned. A dock worker remembered the sky was black. You couldn't tell where the fires ended and the smoke began. The London docks were devastated, but the city did not break. That night, Churchill climbed onto a rooftop in Whitehall to watch the flames rise over the capital. He turned to his aides and said quietly, "They will never break the spirit of the British people." As the bombings continued, the Blitz transformed British life. Every night, Londoners carried blankets and food to underground stations, turning platforms into makeshift dormitories. Children slept through explosions, lulled by exhaustion and the rhythm of distant anti-aircraft guns. In hospitals, nurses worked by candlelight. In factories, workers kept producing aircraft parts through the raids. Even as bombs fell, trains still ran. Mail was still delivered, and the BBC still broadcast the evening news. A young boy later recalled, "The bombs came, but school went on." The next day, the teacher would say, "We've lost a few desks, but we'll manage." This quiet defiance became the soul of Britain's resistance. While London burned, the RAF continued to strike back against invasion preparations. At night, Bomber Command targeted German ports and barge concentrations along the Channel coast: Calais, Boulogne, and Le Havre. These raids destroyed hundreds of barges intended for Operation Sea Lion. One RAF navigator described the sight. "You could see the flames from 20 miles away. The barges were packed tight. One hit, and the whole harbor went up like a bonfire." By early September, Hitler's invasion fleet was crippled. Without air superiority, Operation Sea Lion could not proceed. Still, he refused to cancel it. Not yet. Across the Atlantic, American newspapers and radio broadcasts covered the nightly bombings. Journalists like Edward R. Murrow reported live from London rooftops, their voices echoing through American living rooms. "This is London," Murrow's calm voice declared over the roar of distant bombs. "You can hear the guns firing now, and the people remain calm." His broadcast stirred deep sympathy among Americans. Though the United States was still neutral, public opinion began to shift strongly toward Britain's side. President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered increased support. By late 1940, Britain was receiving vital supplies, aircraft engines, fuel, food, through secret agreements that would soon become the Lend-Lease Act. American industry, still officially neutral, had become Britain's arsenal of survival. Then came the turning point. September 15, 1940, a date now remembered as Battle of Britain Day. Shortly before noon, radar screens lit up again. Another massive formation heading for London. More than 500 German aircraft crossed the channel. The RAF scrambled everything it had. Spitfires and Hurricanes from 11 Group, reinforced by 12 Group squadrons from the Midlands, rose to meet the threat. Over the Thames estuary in central London, a colossal air battle unfolded. Civilians looked up from the streets to see hundreds of aircraft locked in combat above the city. Trails of smoke and flames streaked across the sky. One Londoner wrote, "It was as if the heavens themselves were fighting for us." The RAF shot down more than 60 German aircraft that day. The Luftwaffe's losses were unsustainable. From his command post, Goering raged. His grand offensive had failed. That evening, Churchill visited Fighter Command headquarters. When he asked Air Vice Marshal Keith Park how many fighters remained, Park smiled and said simply, "Enough." 2 days later, on September 17, 1940, Hitler quietly postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. Without air superiority, the invasion was impossible. The Luftwaffe had failed to destroy the RAF. Britain still stood. The war would continue, but the threat of invasion, for now, had passed. The price of victory was terrible. Between July and October 1940, Britain lost 1,744 aircraft and over 500 pilots, many of them among the RAF's best. German losses were far heavier, more than 1,800 aircraft and 2,600 airmen. But the human toll extended far beyond the airfields. By the end of the Blitz, over 60,000 civilians had been killed or severely injured. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. Yet the British people endured. In the days after Battle of Britain Day, life slowly resumed its rhythm. Children returned to bombed-out schools. Men cleared rubble from the streets. Women lined up for rations beneath shattered windows. A sense of pride filled the air. Not triumph, but survival. Churchill's words echoed through the nation once again. This was their finest hour. The skies above England had been a battlefield for nearly 4 months. Now, for the first time, the sun rose on a nation unbroken. The battle was not just won by pilots in the air, but by the courage of millions below, by mechanics, radar operators, nurses, and mothers, by a people who refused to surrender. Britain had stood alone and survived. September 1940. The roar of battle over Britain's skies had faded, but another storm was coming. Hitler's plan to invade had failed. The Luftwaffe had been repelled. But now Germany would strike Britain in a new way, not through invasion, but through terror. The next chapter of the war would unfold not in the daylight of aerial duels, but in the darkness of night. It would be known as the Blitz. On the evening of September 7, 1940, the people of London watched the sunset turn red, not from the horizon, but from fire. For nearly 2 hours, hundreds of German bombers rained destruction on the city. The docks along the Thames were engulfed in flames. Warehouses, homes, factories, all burned together in a sea of smoke. Firefighters battled for hours amid collapsing buildings. The heat was so intense that metal melted and streets cracked. One fireman recalled, "It was like standing in the mouth of a furnace. You couldn't tell night from day. All you could do was keep the hoses going and pray the next bomb didn't find you." That first raid killed 436 people and injured over 1,600. But it was only the beginning. For the next 57 consecutive nights, London would be bombed without mercy. Life during the Blitz developed its own rhythm, a rhythm of endurance. By day, Londoners worked, shopped, and tried to live normally. By night, they descended underground. The London Underground became a vast shelter. Families claimed their spots on platforms, spreading blankets and laying down makeshift beds. Trains still ran during the day, but at night the stations filled with thousands seeking safety. A mother interviewed by the BBC in 1940 said quietly, "The children sleep better here than at home. At least we know the bombs can't reach us down here." Volunteers handed out tea, musicians played violins, and neighbors whispered in the candlelight as bombs thundered above. The people called it the shelter life, and somehow it became a symbol of unity. The East End of London, home to dock workers and factories, bore the worst of the attacks. Night after night, the Luftwaffe returned to target the river docks, power plants, and rail lines. Entire neighborhoods vanished, Stepney, Poplar, Limehouse, reduced to rubble and ash. One survivor described the horror. The ground shook like an earthquake. We came up in the morning, and everything we knew was gone. The streets were just piles of bricks. In the midst of chaos, fire brigades worked shoulder to shoulder with civilians. Volunteer wardens patrolled the streets during raids, guiding people to safety and helping the wounded. Even the city's symbol, St. Paul's Cathedral, was hit repeatedly. On one night in December 1940, an incendiary bomb landed directly on the roof. But miraculously, firefighters extinguished the blaze. When the smoke cleared, the Great Dome still stood, a shining beacon above the ruins. A photograph of St. Paul's rising through the flames became one of the most enduring images of Britain's defiance. London was not alone. Cities across Britain faced the same onslaught. Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, Coventry, Bristol, and Plymouth each became targets in turn. In November 1940, Coventry suffered one of the most devastating raids of the war. More than 500 German bombers struck the city in a single night. Thousands of homes were destroyed. The historic Coventry Cathedral was left a blackened shell. One priest who survived the bombing wrote in his diary, "The whole city was alight. You could read a newspaper in the street at midnight. But we still rang the church bell and to tell them we were alive." From the ashes of Coventry came a new word, coventration, used by the Germans to describe total destruction by bombing. But even that could not break British resolve. While civilians endured the bombings, the RAF adapted. Radar systems, now improved to detect aircraft at night, helped guide night fighter squadrons into position. Aircraft like the Bristol Beaufighter, equipped with early airborne radar, began intercepting German bombers in the darkness. Slowly, the Luftwaffe's losses grew. Its crews, exhausted from nightly raids, found the skies over Britain increasingly dangerous. Meanwhile, RAF Bomber Command continued to strike back. Night after night, British bombers targeted Berlin, Hamburg, and industrial centers in the Ruhr. The raids were still small and often inaccurate, but they sent a powerful message. Britain was not broken. It was fighting back. On the ground, millions joined the Civil Defense Service, a volunteer force of air raid wardens, firefighters, ambulance drivers, and rescue workers. When sirens sounded, they ran toward the danger, not away from it. Wardens patrolled the streets during blackouts, shouting, "Put that light out!" because even a single glimmer could guide enemy bombers. Rescue teams clawed through rubble with bare hands to reach survivors. Women of the Women's Voluntary Service, WVS, served tea to firefighters and distributed food to the homeless. In one night raid, a warden pulled 3 children from a collapsed shelter. He later said, "You didn't think about fear, you just dug. If someone was alive under there, you dug until you found them." Daily life during the Blitz was harsh. Food was rationed, meat, sugar, butter, even tea. Clothing coupons limited what people could buy. Electricity was restricted, and every window was covered in blackout curtains. The streets at night were pitch dark. Cars drove with dimmed headlights. Buses crawled forward under the faint glow of shaded lamps. Yet despite shortages, morale remained high. Community dances, charity concerts, and church services continued. A Londoner later said, "We laughed because if we didn't, we'd cry." You learn to live with the noise, the bombs, the sirens, the silence, after the phrase, "keep calm and carry on," had been printed on government posters before the battle began. But it truly came to life during the Blitz. It wasn't bravado, it was survival. Ordinary people became extraordinary. Mothers led children through burning streets. Bus drivers finished their routes through falling debris. Teachers reopened bombed schools the next morning. As historian Angus Calder later wrote, the British did not win the Blitz by arms, but by the stubborn refusal to surrender their way of life. Across the Atlantic, the images of burning London deeply moved the American public. Newsreels showed children sleeping in underground stations, firemen battling infernos, and Churchill standing amid the rubble. President Franklin D. Roosevelt saw Britain as the last barrier to tyranny. In December 1940, he delivered a speech that would change the course of the war. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself." Within months, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, allowing the United States to supply Britain with ships, aircraft, fuel, and food without immediate payment. By mid-1941, American-built aircraft, such as the P-40 Warhawk and Hudson bomber, were flying with the RAF. It was not yet an alliance, but it was the beginning of one. By early 1941, the Blitz had failed to achieve its goal. British morale remained unbroken. The RAF had survived and was growing stronger, and Hitler's attention was shifting east toward the Soviet Union. In March 1941, the Luftwaffe began reducing its raids on London. The final major attack came on May 10, 1941, when over 500 bombers hit the capital in one of the most devastating nights of the war. More than 1,400 people were killed. The House of Commons was destroyed. But again, Britain endured. Within weeks, German bombers began withdrawing from Western Europe to prepare for Operation Barbarossa. The invasion of Russia? The Blitz was over. The cost of survival was immense. Between September 1940 and May 1941, over 43,000 civilians were killed and more than 86,000 seriously injured. Over 1 million homes were destroyed or damaged. Yet in all that time, Britain never considered surrender. Churchill summed it up best. "London can take it, and so could Coventry, and Liverpool, and every town that stood its ground under the falling bombs." The Blitz changed Britain forever. It broke down social barriers. Rich and poor shared the same shelters, the same fear, and the same determination to live. Women entered the workforce in greater numbers, operating machinery, driving ambulances, and working radar screens. Children who had been evacuated returned home to cities forever altered. Yet their innocence somehow remained. A young evacuee later recalled, "When we came back, the street was gone. But Mom said, 'We're still here, love.' That's what matters." By summer 1941, Britain had survived a year of unrelenting assault. It stood bloodied but unbeaten, a fortress of freedom in a darkened continent. And now it would not stand alone much longer. Across the Atlantic, the United States was rearming. American destroyers patrolled the Atlantic convoys. Factories in Detroit, Seattle, and Los Angeles were working day and night to supply the Allies. The partnership between Roosevelt and Churchill was growing into a friendship that would shape the rest of the war. The Battle of Britain had begun as a struggle for survival. It ended as a symbol of endurance, a victory not just of planes and pilots, but of people. In the ashes of the Blitz, a new hope was born, a hope that freedom could endure against tyranny. Britain had stood alone, but soon it would lead the world's fight for liberation. By the summer of 1941, the fires of the Blitz had burned out. London still smoldered, but Britain stood firm, alive, defiant, unbroken. The Luftwaffe had failed. Hitler's dream of invasion had been shattered by the courage of the few and by the unyielding spirit of the many. But Britain was still alone. Her empire stretched across the world, yet her people knew that without help, the war could not be won. That help was on its way. Across the Atlantic, the United States had watched the Battle of Britain with growing admiration. The courage of the RAF, the endurance of London under fire, and the voice of Churchill echoing across the radio waves, all had stirred the American conscience. In December 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared, "The spirit of democracy is not lost. We must be the great arsenal of democracy." And with those words, America began to arm the defenders of freedom. Factories that once built cars and refrigerators were converted to produce tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. Ships carrying food, oil, and weapons set sail across the Atlantic, their holds filled with lifelines for Britain. It was a dangerous crossing. German U-boats prowled the seas, attacking convoys and sinking hundreds of ships. But the supplies kept coming. The link between the two nations, fragile, perilous, and vital, would become the foundation of the Allied victory. Even before America entered the war, some Americans refused to stand aside. They crossed the Atlantic under false names, lied about their age or nationality, and enlisted in the Royal Air Force. They were known as the Eagle Squadrons, number 71, number 121, and number 133 squadrons, made up of American volunteers flying British Spitfires and Hurricanes. They fought bravely alongside their British comrades, defending the skies over England and later carrying the fight into occupied Europe. One volunteer, pilot officer Bill Dunn, said, "We weren't fighting for medals. We were fighting for something bigger, for the right to live free." By 1942, these squadrons had become legends, symbols of transatlantic brotherhood. When the United States finally entered the war, the Eagle Squadrons were transferred into the U.S. Army Air Forces, forming the core of the 4th Fighter Group, the first American air unit to fight from British soil. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. Overnight, the United States was at war, not just in the Pacific, but against Germany as well. For Britain, it was the moment Churchill had long awaited. He later wrote, "No American will ever know what it meant to me to hear the news that the United States was in the war." We had won after all. Within weeks, American troops, engineers, and airmen began arriving in Britain. They brought energy, equipment, and hope. The Atlantic was no longer a lifeline. It was a bridge. By 1942, the U.S. 8th Air Force, the mighty 8th, was established in England. Its mission, to bring the war to Germany's doorstep through daylight precision bombing. From bases across East Anglia, waves of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators rose into the cold morning skies, heading east across the Channel. Their targets, factories, rail lines, oil refineries, and the industrial heart of the Third Reich. It was the beginning of a new kind of air war, massive, methodical, and merciless. Each mission was a journey through hell. Flak bursts tore through bomber formations. German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs attacked relentlessly. A B-17 gunner remembered, "The sky looked like boiling metal. You could smell cordite and fear, but we stayed in formation because alone you didn't make it home." The casualty rate was staggering. In 1943, an American bomber crewman's chance of survival was less than 50%. But they kept flying, day after day, month after month, and slowly the tide began to turn. The partnership between the RAF and USAAF was not just military, it was personal. British and American airmen shared bases, shared meals, shared grief. They trained together, fought together, and sometimes died together. The RAF flew by night, the Americans by day, a relentless, round-the-clock offensive that became known as the Combined Bomber Offensive. While British Lancasters bombed German cities after dark, American flying fortresses struck factories in daylight. The pressure on Germany's war machine became unbearable. In 1944, with the skies largely cleared of the Luftwaffe, the Allies finally achieved the air supremacy that had eluded Hitler in 1940. The lessons learned in the Battle of Britain, coordination, radar control, fighter escort, were now being used on a global scale. The defenders had become the conquerors. On June 6, 1944, the lessons of 1940 bore fruit. The Allied invasion of Europe, Operation Overlord, known to history as D-Day, was launched from Britain's shores. It was an invasion on a scale Hitler had once dreamed of, but never achieved. Before the first troops landed on Normandy's beaches, the skies were already in Allied hands. RAF and USAF fighters swept over France, destroying railways, bridges, and communications. Bombers targeted German positions hours before the landings began. The invasion was the ultimate proof that control of the air meant control of destiny. A British air marshal said later, "Without the victory in the Battle of Britain, there would have been no D-Day." America's contribution went far beyond bombers and fighters. The U.S. Lend-Lease program had by 1945 supplied over $31 billion in materials to Britain: tanks, trucks, ships, food, and fuel. American shipyards launched a new Liberty ship every few days. Convoys of trucks and jeeps rolled across England's roads, filling the airfields and docks that powered the Allied war effort. And through it all, British and American engineers continued to collaborate, developing new radar, advanced navigation, and the first jet aircraft. The alliance forged in the fires of 1940 had become the foundation of the modern world. Even after victory, the Battle of Britain continued to define Britain's identity and America's admiration. To the British, it was proof that courage could overcome chaos, that a small island could stand against tyranny. To the Americans, it was a symbol of shared values, of freedom, democracy, and unyielding will. In the post-war years, U.S. airmen who had served in Britain often returned to visit the old airfields. Grass now grown over runways, hangars silent and empty. They found themselves welcomed as brothers. One veteran wrote home, "We came here as strangers and left as family." As the war drew to a close, the generation that had fought the Battle of Britain was hailed as legendary. Of the 2,937 RAF pilots who took part in the battle, 544 were killed. They came not only from Britain, but from the Commonwealth, Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, and even neutral countries. They had saved a nation, and perhaps the world. Their legacy lived on in the words of Winston Churchill, spoken in Parliament on August 20th, 1940. "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Those few, now old men, their numbers dwindling, would carry that honor to their graves. The bond forged between Britain and America during those years of fire would endure for generations. Together they had fought not just a war, but for an idea, that freedom was worth defending, no matter the cost. From the ashes of war rose a new alliance, NATO, the special relationship, and a shared commitment to global peace. It all began in 1940, in the skies over southern England, when a few hundred pilots held the line against tyranny and fear. The Battle of Britain was more than a military victory. It was a triumph of courage over despair, of light over darkness, of freedom over fear. In the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone. By 1945, she stood with the world. And through it all, the roar of engines, the courage of pilots, and the steadfast hearts of ordinary people echoed the same unbreakable truth. This was their finest hour. The year is 1945. Europe is free once more. The guns are silent. The skies, once filled with smoke and fire, are blue again. But for those who fought the Battle of Britain, for the few who gave everything in that desperate summer of 1940, the memories never faded. When the war finally ended, Britain emerged scarred but victorious. Its cities lay in ruins. Its people were weary, but it had survived and triumphed. The victory in the Battle of Britain had been the first step in a long road that led from the brink of invasion to the beaches of Normandy, and ultimately to peace. It was, as Churchill said, not the end, nor even the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning. The battle had proven something extraordinary, that courage, unity, and innovation could overcome overwhelming odds. And it had shown the world that freedom was not fragile. It was fierce. The cost, however, was immense. During those 4 months in 1940, the RAF lost 1,744 aircraft and 544 pilots. Men who never saw the victory they had secured. They came from across the globe. 2,353 from the United Kingdom, 574 from other allied nations, 145 from Poland, 88 from Canada, 32 from New Zealand, 28 from Belgium, 25 from Czechoslovakia, and many others from the Commonwealth and beyond. Some had fled Nazi occupation to continue the fight from British soil. They carried with them the flags of their fallen nations, and in the skies above England, they fought for the freedom of all mankind. Their bravery became legend, their loss, a wound that time could never fully heal. For those who survived, peace brought no easy rest. Many pilots returned to ordinary lives. Teachers, farmers, engineers, fathers. They rarely spoke of what they had seen. One veteran later said, "We didn't think of ourselves as heroes. We just did our job and tried to come home alive." The trauma ran deep. Nightmares of burning skies, the faces of lost friends, the silence after the fight. These haunted many for decades, but they carried their memories quietly, with the same quiet dignity that had carried them through the war. In the years that followed, Britain rebuilt. Brick by brick, street by street, the ruins of London became the foundations of renewal. The Blitz had destroyed, but it had also united. The war gave birth to a new social spirit, a sense of shared struggle and shared hope. It led to the founding of the National Health Service, to new housing, new education, and a commitment that such suffering should never happen again. The sound of hammers replaced the sound of bombs. The same courage that had defended the skies now rebuilt the nation below. The Battle of Britain was more than a British victory. It was a turning point for the entire world. For the first time in the war, Hitler had been stopped. His plan to conquer Western Europe, to cross the Channel and enslave a continent, was shattered by a few hundred young men and a nation that refused to bow. That victory gave hope to occupied Europe. From Paris to Warsaw, from Oslo to Athens, people whispered that Britain still fought and that freedom still lived. And in the United States, it transformed public opinion. The sight of a small island standing alone against tyranny moved millions of Americans to believe that this was a cause worth fighting for. When the U.S. entered the war, it did so not to rescue a fallen ally, but to join one that had endured. The Battle of Britain had made that possible. The lessons learned in 1940 would shape air warfare for generations. The Dowding system, Britain's integrated network of radar, observers, and command centers, became the blueprint for modern air defense. The concept of air superiority, first proven in those desperate months, became a cornerstone of all future military strategy. The radar innovations born during the battle led to advances in electronics, aviation, and even peacetime science. In every sense, the Battle of Britain was not just a victory of courage, but a triumph of intellect and innovation. While the pilots became icons, the civilians who endured the Blitz carried their own heroism. The mothers who carried children into shelters, the firemen who stood beneath collapsing walls, the nurses who worked through the night. They were, in Churchill's words, the lion-hearted. Many never received medals, but their endurance was the quiet backbone of Britain's survival. A Londoner remembered years later, "We had nothing left. No homes, no furniture, nothing. But we still had each other. That was enough." As decades passed, the nation sought ways to honor the fallen. In 1947, the Battle of Britain Chapel was dedicated in Westminster Abbey, its stained glass windows depicting the squadrons who fought and died. In 1951, the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight was formed, a living tribute of Spitfires, Hurricanes, and a Lancaster bomber, still flying in memory of those who once defended the skies. Each summer, their engines echo across the fields of Kent and Sussex, the same fields where the battle was once fought. In 1993, on the cliffs of Capel le Fern, near Folkestone, a National Battle of Britain memorial was unveiled. A solitary pilot seated in contemplation, looking out across the channel toward the land from which the enemy came. Beneath him, engraved in stone, are the names of the few. They sit in silence, guardians of history, forever watching over the waters they once protected. As the years passed, the ranks of the Battle of Britain veterans grew thinner. Men who had been 19 in 1940 were in their 90s by the 21st century. They were often asked how they wished to be remembered. One simply said, "Remember that we did our duty, and that we loved this country each passing year. Fewer of the few remain, but their legacy endures in museums, books, films, and in the quiet gratitude of generations who never knew war as they did. When the last surviving aces are gone, their stories will still echo, in the skies they defended and in the freedom they secured." In the United States, too, the legacy of the Battle of Britain is honored. The bravery of the RAF inspired America's own airmen, the Tuskegee Airmen, the 8th Air Force, and countless others who followed their example of courage and sacrifice. Memorials in Washington, D.C., and across the country pay tribute to the bond forged in that battle, a bond that began before America even entered the war. Each year on Battle of Britain Day, September 15th, British and American airmen stand side by side to remember not just victory, but friendship. Today, the Battle of Britain stands as more than history. It is a lesson for every generation. It teaches that courage can rise from fear, that unity can grow from hardship, and that freedom must be defended. Always. It reminds us that wars are not won by machines alone, but by the will of ordinary people who refuse to surrender. In an age of technology and distance, the story of 1940 still whispers across time. Stand firm. Resist. Hope. They were young ones, the pilots of the few. They soared into the skies when the world seemed to be falling apart. They fought, and many fell, so that others might live in freedom. Now their aircraft rest in museums, their names etched in stone, but the sound of their courage still fills the wind. When a Spitfire flies low over the English countryside, you can almost hear them, laughing, shouting, fighting, the sound of defiance, the sound of victory. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The Battle of Britain was not just a fight for a nation, it was a fight for civilization itself. And when the world needed heroes, they came, from farms, from cities, from across oceans, to defend the sky. They were the few. They were the first to turn the tide, and they will never be forgotten.